Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to Extreme Graphics Tech. My name is Angelo, and today's video is a little bit different because it started as a little silly experiment curiosity from me. So, what I mean, I wasn't sure about what sort of videos to do. Sometimes I am completely out of ideas, or if I have an idea, it depends on me buying something which I can buy because I don't have the money for it. So there is nothing I can do. So I started making, I thought I'm going to make a very silly video that is just about, can you play at 4K on a $300 GPU? Can you play modern games on a $300 GPU at 4K? And for that, the GPU I chose was the RTX 4060. It was just a silly video just to see how capable it is, what sort of sacrifices you have to do, and obviously I was going to use any trick in the book to play a 4K. What I mean with that is, using DLSS at performance, ultra performance, put it in game and low, using frame generation, whatever I needed to get those 4K at 60 FPS or close to 60 FPS as possible, right? Without, either putting the game in potato mode. But that was the point, just as a silly experiment. But this silly experiment ended up being more interesting than I thought initially. And why? Well, because as you know, the RTX 4060 is not a GPU that is being created or taught to play at 4K. We know that for many reasons. The first one is that only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which is going to create more problems than one I'm going to explain. But there is one specific problem that is really too bad when you think about it, right? But okay, anyway, that's because we are playing at 4K. But also because this car has a memory bus of just 128-bit, which is very narrow, right? And so that also creates like a sort of bottleneck for the GPU. So 4K is like too much data going through that very little bandwidth space. So those two things make difficult to play a 4K on this car. However, of course, you can play games like Batman Arkham Knight, Arkham Asylum, City, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, all games at 4K. It shouldn't have too much troubles because it has power enough to play many of those games. But the point was modern games, like from 2022 to 2024, what games can we play at 4K with this? I'm going to show you what I found after testing like a dozen of games, and then I'm going to come with my conclusion because there are some interesting finds that I did and I want to share it with you. And the first game I wanted to try was obviously Doom Eternal because, well, this is a very well optimized game. Oh my god, if it runs well. Here we play at 4K, DLSS balance, Ultra Nightmare with ray tracing on, and the game is running just spectacular over 60 FPS most of the time. I say most because there could be areas of the game where it goes lower. I am not sure, but so far it's running really good, and we can always lower some settings or maybe use DLSS performance. Another game that we have tested before, the Channel Dying Light 2, and we know this we can play at 4K. In this case, we're using DLSS performance, but no ray tracing option. Using frame generation doesn't help on this game because at 4K the games max out the VRAM available, and then the frame generation option doesn't really do much to help in this situation. Even though you see that we are only using 5.7 gigs of VRAM, when we activate frame generation, it doesn't really do much. Another game that is running better than I was expecting to is Hogwarts Legacy. We can play a DLSS balance medium 4K. Which, it's quite good if you're trying to max out your panel, your TV or anything. You can have all those nice pixels there and have a nice and crisp image. So in this case, we can see that the game is running quite well, even though there are some slight dips under 60 a couple of times. But still, the game looks phenomenal, even a medium. Horizon Forbidden West is, well, one of the latest game, and it's a beautiful game. And this is a game where you have to use, or I prefer to use, DLSS dynamic resolution. And in this case, what it happens is that it changes the resolution internally, but then it scales to 4K using DLSS. And so medium settings to be able to get like the best balance of graphics and resolution. And I think it still looks quite good on this game. The Last of Us is another game that is not super well optimized, but it has improved, and we can again play at DLSS performance 4K using medium. But it's unfortunate that we can use the high textures because of the VRAM. As you can see, we're almost maxed out. If we go to high textures, then the VRAM is maxed out, and we can use. This game doesn't support frame generation with DLSS because yet. I think they are going to include FSR3, or it does have FSR3, but it's not quite good apparently, so I didn't activate it in this case. Spider-Man, well, this is a game we can play at 4K DLSS performance on high settings with RT reflections on 7 as the distance, and I think it's very important, the reflection in this game, for the sort of games it is and where it happens. So I think it looks phenomenal, all things considered. And this game, we were able to play 4K with a 4060, which is quite nice if you ask me. Well, Quake RTX, you know, it's sort of cheating because we are using dynamic resolution scaling, and maybe it's running internally at 1080p because we have a very high scale there. But what I was thinking is, in many of these games, you could, if you have a VRR monitor, sorry, you can set it up like a 40 FPS some of the games, and you will get in the middle of having nice fluid motion, but also you can up some settings, or you know, like instead of playing on low, you can play on medium. For example, here on 4K DLSS performance, we can play on medium at Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. As you can see, well, the game runs well, but we're missing on those reflections because the moment we activate it, it goes down. But if we set the frame rate to 40 FPS, then we will have better fluid motion than 30, but still having more options available to us to play with more settings. So I think that will be a very good middle point for a card like this. In the case of Starfield, well, as you see, I'm playing on 4K medium using DLSS performance, and I have to activate frame generation on. However, I have to say that when you're playing without frame generation, the game doesn't dip to like 30 or 40. It's actually around 50. So for some reason, frame generation here was only giving me like 10 FPS. It didn't feel bad or weird, but it's strange that we are not doubling, and I think this has to do with the VRAM problem that I was mentioning before, as you can see there. A game that was very hard to move at 4K even without ray tracing was Cyberpunk. For some reason, the game can be played at path trace if you got on down in resolution, so I was expecting it to be a little bit better, but we had to use DLSS ultra performance and frame generation on to be able to get to 60 FPS. But again, what I'm trying to prove here is that, well, you know, you have to make some sacrifice, but you can actually play some games at 4K. And if you don't mind playing at 30 FPS, you can probably get a lot more visual quality or even ray tracer options if you, you know, limit yourself to 30 FPS or 40 in some games. The same problem we had with Witcher. Instead of this case, we are not using DLSS ultra performance, but every other setting is exactly the same. And as you can see, we barely get to 60 FPS. So I think this engine that CD Projekt uses is probably bandwidth hunger, so it needs quite a lot of bandwidth to be able to achieve those high resolutions. A game that I wasn't expecting, however, to be able to even hit 60 FPS at 4K no matter what was Alan Wake 2, but here we are almost at 60 FPS using DLSS ultra performance on low. So if we limit to 30 FPS, we probably will get very better quality. We can use DLSS balance or maybe some RT options. The interesting part, I think, with this game is the fact that this is the worst case scenario, because there are other areas where this game is probably going to be hitting around 80 FPS. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition is a game that I really like because it's the pioneer, in my opinion, about ray tracing, and it looks phenomenal. I don't test it that often because, as you can see here, I am at the beginning. I was playing this and I lost my save game, you know, I had to start from the beginning and I was almost at the end. So it's a game that I don't know, I have to take again and play again in order to be able to get to some point where the testing is better. But well, I wanted to show it here that even in this case you can play this at 4K. The last game I'm testing is Avatar. This is a game where we could not get to 60 FPS stable. Maybe going to DLSS ultra performance will have help, but I could not get in DLSS performance. But however, as I said before, if we limit this game to 40 FPS, maybe we can get that fluid motion and at the same time get better settings. So yeah, all in all, not bad. So as we saw, some results were quite interesting. I can say that, well, obviously this is not a 4K card. I'm going to repeat that, okay? But some games can be played at 4K, even with ray tracing. Games like Spider-Man, some games that I was expecting they not to work at all, like for example Alan Wake 2, we were able to play a 4K almost with 60. There is going to be areas where it's going to be above 60. Right, of course, we use, as I said, every trick in the book: DLSS, ultra performance, low in some cases, frame generation when I could, and so on and so on. And here comes the first problem: frame generation. Unfortunately, by having 8 gigabytes of VRAM, frame generation becomes more of an issue at 4K than anything else, and it's not going to give you any performance. And why is that? Well, because the VRAM is completely full, and frame generation requires some VRAM to work, a lot of VRAM in fact. And so what happens is when we go to 4K, it's already maxed out, and when we activate frame generation in some games, we actually lost performance, like for example in Horizon Forbidden West. That game's run much better at 4K with this GPU without frame generation than with it. So it's not like a magic thing that it's going to double, unfortunately, because obviously it requires a lot of frame information to work, and it requires a lot of VRAM. So those 8 gigabytes are creating a big issue in this card for that reason. Okay, so some of those games we couldn't play with frame generation. Another thing is that I tested Cyberpunk at 1080p path trace with this GPU, and it was working fine at 1080p. So I found very surprising that it was so hard to play at 4K without any ray tracing at all. So clearly some games behave completely different, because then Dying Light 2 we can play at ultra without too much issue at 4K, even a game that has ray tracing, but Cyberpunk wasn't, and The Witcher wasn't. So yeah, there are some things there, right? But in general, some games can be played, some games cannot. It was interesting, but the interesting part for me was that after I finished making all those tests, I was thinking, so the two biggest problems I have with this GPU is the lack of VRAM and the narrow bandwidth bus for the memory. So there is another GPU that doesn't have these issues, and that's the RTX 3060. The only problem is that card doesn't have frame generation. But let's test some of the games that I tested without frame generation, and that's what I did because I was curious. Is the extra VRAM and the bit higher bandwidth at 4K in same situation on this card going to narrow the gap between them? And testing, no, there was no gap closed. Those cards are normally like 15%, 10 to 15% difference normally, and Tech Power Up seems to be in those lines too. So when I tested, I was expecting to narrow that difference just because I was, a 4K and so on, and I just expected that maybe the memory and the bandwidth was going to make this like bottleneck, and the RTX 3060 was going to breathe a little bit more, and that meant that I wasn't expecting the 3060 to be faster, but maybe closer. But no, it wasn't. The difference was the same, 10 to 50% in all the games in the same scenario. So that means at the end of the day, when we think that many of the criticism that was given to this card, of course, I would have expected this card to have 12 gigabytes and a higher bandwidth, because probably that the difference in performance will have been higher. But what I'm trying to say is that even if previous card or previous technology, previous releases have some advantages in some areas, doesn't mean that those areas that we criticize are going to make this car worse than the previous generation on the same scale. So these cars, even with all the limitations, is obviously faster in every single level, and the only difference that we are going to get from RTX 3060 is the fact that we can use higher resolution textures in some games than on this one. Because then when we start playing, and no matter how much VRAM it has, that is not going to make the GPU faster, because if you put that GPU anyway in ultra or anything like that, the performance is going to be so low that at the end of the day, RTX 4060 in the same settings is going to probably be faster at in every level. So I found that interesting because there was a lot of criticism about the memory bandwidth, that how is it possible that it's worse than the 3060 that has less VRAM. But at the end of the day, this is a superior card, even with those limitations. That's what I found. No matter what or how you want to put it, this is a superior card, and I don't think that RTX 3060 is going to last longer just because it has 12 gigabytes of VRAM or a bigger or a higher bandwidth memory bus. If you're going to buy new, then it's always better in the same level of performance to buy the latest technology, because at the end of the day, you are not going to narrow the gap with lower or past technology just based on some specs, because the specs are that it's just specs. Remember, this has more cache memory, this is a newer technology, it uses less energy and so on. So even if it's, you know, it's not the best that it could have been, because I think with 12 gigabytes of VRAM and a 192-bit bus, this card will have been a killer. Well, you know, even in this situation, if you're going to buy new, I will buy a 4060 all the time over a 3060, if that, you know, because I'm not going to get anything really out of the 3060 that is going to be better than this one. So that was interesting because, as I said, I put it like the extreme case, right? I put it like on the extreme case, 4K and all these things, thinking that the 3060 was going to close the gap, and I didn't. It was interesting to see it from a technology point of view, because the advantages that the 3060 was given were not enough to close the gap between a newer card with some handicap specs. At the end of the day, the specs don't matter, it's the performance. It doesn't matter if they put a 1-bit of bus in here, as long as it's faster and better. What do you care? And that's honestly, it's been proven, at least by me. I am converted now. I don't care. Well, I don't care in the sense of compared to previous generations. Obviously, you always want them to do better, and I think this card, you know, should have had 12 gigabytes on a higher bandwidth memory bus. But well, this is what we got. Anyway, that's all. I think it was interesting findings for me. I hope you found interesting too, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel. I'm very close to 1,000 subs, and it will make me very happy to get to that number. So please subscribe, like, share it with your friends. It's free, and you will be helping me a lot. Thank you, and see you on the next one.